Very nice.
Hey, it's 5 o'clock. I think we should get going at our second EPA Brownfield Assessment Grant update. As part of our program, we want to reach out to all the residents of Fulton County, describe what we're doing with the EPA grant, how it's working, our results, and what our anticipated goals will be. My name is Ron Peters. I'm with the President and CEO of the Fulton County Center for Regional Growth. We are the subrecipient of the EPA grant. So what is it? What is a? Let's just go through what a brownfield is. A brownfield can be any kind of a site where you may have a suspected contamination or some kind of unknown. It doesn't necessarily mean that it has any contamination on it, but therefore we do have the possibility with the EPA assessment grant of taking any unknowns out of the site. Our brownfield program goals are to reach out to as many sites as possible, conduct as many phase ones as we can with the grant proceeds. If need be, go to a phase 2 assessment, then identify the top handful of sites that we can move toward cleanup and or get redeveloped and get those properties potentially back on the tax rolls again. Our actions to date is that we have identified 47 sites that we have been looking at. We've done over a dozen phase ones. We've conducted one public outreach session. And this session here, we'll be identifying certain sites that we want to move to the next level. Let me do the introductions. The lead agency with the cooperative extension recipient is CRG. Our EPA Brownfield Region 2 project officer is Yocasta De Jesus. Our environmental consultants will be doing the phase 1s, 2, and the EPA remediation plans are Tom Sedgwick and Mark Wright from HRP Associates. And for public planning and public outreach, we have Jane Harriman and Joelle Greenland with the Center for Creative Land Recycling. Our task force specific folks that we are working with on our committee is myself and Desiree Perm from the Fulton County Center for Regional Growth. We have Rick Argesinger. He is the Fulton County Supervisor from the town of Mayfield, also the chairman of the Economic Development Committee at the county. Greg Fagan, he's the chairman of the Fulton County Board of Supervisors. Jack Wilson, he's the Fulton County Board of Supervisors from the town of Johnstown. Scott Hensey, he's the Fulton County Planning Director. Tim Beckett, he's the Fulton County Center for Regional Growth Board Chair. And Travis Mitchell, the Fulton County Center for Regional Growth Vice Chair. That makes up our Brownfield Task Force. This is the group that looks over these sites, determines which ones should go to phase 1, and then is working with us on identifying the next step with the process. I'd like to introduce Tom Sedgwick. Tom will be talking about our brownfields and our brownfield sites.
All right, thank you, Ron. My name's Tom Sedgwick. I'm with HRP, and what I'm going to do is just give some background on what is brownfield and how we handle them. And then Mark Wright of HRP will discuss particular sites we're working on. So as Ron pointed out earlier, what is a brownfield? Brownfield is really any site that has known or has perceived contamination. Because what happens is if there's perceived contamination on a site, meaning it's contaminated, obviously, a lot of times the developers will walk away from the site. Lenders will not make loans on the site, and the site just sits stagnant and it deteriorates over time. So for example, here are some sites in the Fulton County area. Carvo Leather Company was a tannery. Tanneries use an assortment of chemicals, mainly which contain chromium. They have a tendency to contaminate sites. On the other hand, one of the good news about a lot of tanneries are located on streams, and a lot of the contamination gets washed away over time, is a lot of the reality of it. We also have Arrow Leather and Lee Dyeing, same situation, using other hazardous chemicals. but we don't know if the site's contaminated or not. It's just perceived to be contaminated at this point. So we have to do an phase 1 and phase 2 to determine that. Then there's also Mohawk furniture. Mohawk furniture operations did spray painting, stored hazardous chemicals, any spillage could lead to contamination. And then a lot of times, brownfields are just vacant fields you'll see. The question in this particular case, there was a former chemical manufacturer on site that had contaminated the site potentially. So that we know the site's vacant now, and we have to look at the history to determine if it's contaminated or not. So these are examples of brownfields. And so if you could move to the next slide there, Ken, for me, thank you. So what really are our goals under this brownfield program? There's really 2 levels of goals. One was at the community level, and the other one is at the site-specific level. With the community level, it's really about raising awareness. One of our goals is to get active public participation to help us identify sites and determine the best uses of the sites. We need public engagement. Also, to educate site owners that having a contaminated site is not the end of the world. There's a number of tools out there I'll go over briefly that can help maneuver these sites through cleanup and deal with the liability issues and relieve the lenders so that they can loan money and open up new purchasing to it. And also educate local officials on the potential of these brownfield sites and the tools we have. Then we also have to prioritize all these sites that Ron had mentioned. I think it's 47 or 49 sites we mentioned. Which ones do we want to focus on? And throughout the process, we have to engage the public to help us make these decisions, because our goal is to return these sites that have nothing on them to productive use. A lot of them are in tax arrears or in REMs, as some call it, because the owner knows no one's going to foreclose on the site. So they sit there and they don't pay the taxes on it, and everyone's afraid to foreclose on it. So it just sits there idle. So we have to go in there and break that log jam. So the bottom line is, and one of my favorite moments of last year when we did the Brownfield Summit was Kristen Mercurio, who was up on the stage and more or less just said, if no one does this, if no one takes on these brownfields, no one else will. We have to step up and take care of them. Otherwise, these sites will continue to decay and rot, go to blight, and they're also public. They also have public hazards to the public. So on a site-specific basis, what we wanted to do is determine if a site that's been identified, if it's actually contaminated and to what extent. Once we do that, we can put the environmental issues in a box. And there are a number of developers out there that look for brownfield sites because there are tax credits that they can take advantage of that helps the site move forward. Then we have to determine the actual site reuse goal for that particular site. That way, then we can position the site for future development. Either A, that the community puts out an RFP for it and attracts a developer to it, or it gets directly sold to a developer who's looking for brownfield tax credit. And also, we want to partner with DEC, EPA, the site owner developers, because all of these people are important. Then the last thing is we need to market these sites forward. So just quickly, looking at the brownfield processes, it's just really going out, developing a brownfield inventory, selecting sites for the phase 1. The phase 1 helps us identify, was there any operations on site that have the potential? And it's the key is the potential to contaminate a site. And then we move it to the sites that we select to go to phase 2 on. We actually go out and collect physical samples to determine if the site was contaminated. This is where you collect soil samples, you collect groundwater samples, and you compare them to DEC standards to see if they're above it. Then the site is contaminated and officially it becomes a brownfield, shall we say. Then out of those, let's say we do phase 2s on 6 or 7 sites, then we have to key in on just several sites where we're going to actually develop a conceptual reuse plan that a site might be used for housing or for commercial development or convert it into a park. Then we can develop conceptual plans for that, and then we can develop a remediation plan around that. And then some would say the easiest part, some would say the hardest part is to attract the developer to it to make it happen.
But once you attract the developer time and that product gets back in the tax rolls, that generates a lot of cash and a lot of sales tax revenue for Fulton County and the location where that property is, municipality that property is located within.
Absolutely, and it also helps from a psychological perspective, because it amazes me how so many people accept blight now because they drive by it every day. They know no different. We have to change their attitude to realize that we can do this and turn that site around and make it productive and eliminate those hazards. And so what are, just go to the next slide. So what are some of the barriers to the success? As I just pointed out, public acceptance. People accept the way things are. We have to change that. We have to let people know that we can take that site, remove the public hazard, and return it to the tax rolls. Also, a lot of times, one of the barriers to success of these programs, you have recalcitrant property owners who are afraid to find out their site is contaminated. We have to educate them and the public officials to the tools that are available, which I'll talk about in a second, that in some ways it can be an opportunity that there are brownfield tax credits for them. And then site access can be an issue, because if it's a privately held site, technically we can't get on it unless we get the site owner's permission. And that goes back to educating the site owners. And then funding, right? Who's going to fund these site investigations? Well, the good news is, if we go to the next slide, the good news is that there's a number of available tools. EPA has a number of funding sources. Under Ron's guidance, the Center for Regional Growth won a $300,000 grant to develop a brownfield program, help identify these sites, do phase 1s and phase 2s. Beyond that, the state of New York under DEC has the Environmental Restoration Program, which provides funding to do site investigations and remediation of sites. So there is funding available. Then there's also all the CFA programs and Restore New York to demolish buildings. There's a number of programs out there to assist with this. And one of the most powerful, though, is the DEC's brownfield tax credits. That's how you can attract the private developer. They can get tax credits, 15 to 50% tax credits for the cost of the remediation. And then they can get tax credits from like 15 to 25% of all the tangible assets they bring to the site. That means whatever they build on the site is eligible for tax credits. So if they do a project from remediation to building a building on the site that costs them $10 million, they might get $2 million alone in brownfield tax credits. Then there's also a number of liability relief mechanisms that can relieve a private owner, if done correctly, of liability. And that's not exactly true, but there are legal mechanisms that they can help maneuver to relieve them of some liabilities. And it's especially meant for a third party that comes in, or an innocent municipality owner that can then get relieved of their liabilities. But you got to do it correctly. This is where the lawyers come in. You got to take these mechanisms and use them correctly. So if, for example, a lot of times you'll find that properties, a potential brownfield site that has a lot of redevelopment potential, the owner is not paying their taxes and everyone is concerned about foreclosing on the site. There are mechanisms for the county to go in and foreclose on the site and get access to the site to make the decision, then foreclose on it and get the site moving forward. Sometimes we cannot get access to a site. There are mechanisms for the county or the taxing jurisdiction to go to a local judge and say they haven't paid their taxes. We want to get on a site to do our due diligence to determine if we can foreclose on it. The county, the judge will generally give you permission for a period of time, 60 to 90 days, to do your due diligence to determine if it's worthwhile to foreclose on a site. So there are tools that one can use to move these sites forward. So quickly, actions to date. You go to the next slide. So the Center for Regional Growth received a $300,000 grant from EPA. And one thing about these EPA grants that is great is that once you're in the family, you do a good job, show up on time, they'll take care of you. We just got to show progress. This grant allows us to inventory and assess and investigate sites and develop remediation plans. The Center for Regional Growth under Ron's tutelage created a task force. We have a public participation program in place. And then Betsy Emery, if I recall correctly, developed a website. So now there's information available on the CRG website about the program and what's getting done. One of the bigger things, in my opinion, is CRG hosted the first Mohawk Valley Brownfield Developer Summit. Ken and Desiree and Ron were all in the room with me and others were very instrumental in pulling that all together. And what it did was raise people's awareness to brownfields. And as I always say, to me, that program is really, it's about getting brownfield developers, but more so, it's about building the excitement. Because once you get other developers in here, they'll start looking for other sites, and then the brownfields will start to get caught up in it. So we have to build that momentum, and that's what we're working on. And the first one we did in 2022 was fantastic. It got a lot of interest. And we're going to have another one in 2023 that's going to be in Herkimer County. So in summary, actions to date, the Brownfield Task Force has identified, I say over 50 there, the number's right there. To be honest, I forget exactly what it is. We've reviewed the site for ownership, access, potential uses. Based on those screening criteria, we've completed phase ones on 13 sites that have the potential for redevelopment. Now what we're doing is we're working on, and actually the next line is incorrect. I identified 4 sites for phase 2s. We're working on 4 sites to conduct phase 2s. That's actually where you go collect the information to determine if it's contaminated. And I'll say it again. Some developers will say they get excited when they find out it's contaminated, because then, as Ron will call these aren't brownfields, they're really gold fields. The developers who knows how to maneuver these sites can get incredible tax credits on these sites. And then our goal is to at least have 2 sites that will have all the environmental information, a remediation plan, and a conceptual redevelopment plan for the site. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark Wright, who is going to speak about specific sites we're working on.
Thank you, Tom. So yeah, I'll take a walk with you guys through several of the sites that we are in the process of completing phase 1s on, kind of go over some of the details and talk a little bit about some of the potential. So this first slide is a map generated out of one of our task force meetings, and this is kind of the range of sites. And you know, we've got a lot of sites down in the Johnstown area, 3 or 4 up in Northville, and a couple out in the western portion of the county. Even though we are, you know, well on our way toward developing phase 1s on, you know, several identified priority sites and trying to secure and identify phase 2 sites, we are still looking for more sites in the inventory. This is certainly not every site in the county, and, you know, we want to get this inventory to be as complete as possible. Let's move into the first site. And this is a site in Johnstown. It's in a really great location next to the rail trail. This is the Carville Leather Plant. So this is a plant that was an industrial site for 100+ years. As far back as the records go, someone was doing manufacturing at this facility. And then they just walked away, leaving behind potentially some subsurface contamination and certainly some chemicals still left above ground. So EPA did a small removal action with some of these chemicals, kind of partway secured the building so that people couldn't come in and cause issues. And we did a phase 1 on this site and identified, some prior uses, an area where there was an old wash plant, some places that, we think it's worth doing a subsurface investigation to see how bad the contamination may be. And again, like Tom was saying before, these are sites that we don't have any proven contamination. That's just a perception at this point. And so that's kind of the status of Carville, and it's in a good spot. And I think one of the things we want to get out of these meetings is, what should the future use of this property be? Is it a spot for housing, green space? The choices are really kind of limitless with the potential of some of these sites.
Mark, if I could ask a question quickly here. So I noticed it's zoned as manufacturing. How does that play into the game, or does it?
So the zoning is a challenge that we can overcome. Just because a property is zoned as manufacturing now, it doesn't mean it always has to be. And you know, you do want a good base. You want a mixture of uses. People need places to work. People need places to shop. People need places to live. People need places for recreation. And I think that, you know, one of the goals is to build consensus on what the use should be for a property. And we shouldn't necessarily be limited by the zoning. When you look at the overhead view of this site, you can see that it's in a neighborhood. So whether manufacturing is the best use, originally 100 years ago, this site was put right there for manufacturing because it's on the river and it was on the railroad. The river is not a manufacturing tool anymore. We don't use it for discharge or for power, and the railroad's gone. It's a recreational pathway now. So, you know, evaluating whether manufacturing is the proper use of this kind of site is a part of the process. So let's go on to Crossland, and this one's a little more straightforward. Crossland is a farm that was abandoned, basically, and there is probably not a whole lot of contamination left behind. You know, there's concerns with a dilapidated building associated with agricultural use. You can get some issues with pesticides. We don't have any specific information for that. And I think that this site is a great site for a future industrial park. And I think that's the idea behind including this site in the progress, is to do the environmental due diligence, use a EPA funding to do environmental due diligence on a project that can now be moved forward into the next stage of planning.
So if I could ask you a question, Mark, so why, if it's a farm, would you still have to do a phase one on it? Why would you be concerned?
So you want to do a phase one before you acquire any property that is not a house, I guess, a straightforward residential property. What that does is it satisfies one of the conditions of CERCLA, which is the federal brownfields regulation, and it allows you to position yourself as a bona fide potential purchaser. That among some other things you'd have to do, and that allows you to be not held liable for a cleanup under CERCLA if something does end up being the case here. Basically, it's a documenting of existing environmental conditions so that you have a defense that says you weren't the one that caused the contamination. The EPA and DEC are not interested in pursuing cleanup costs and cleanups against people that are not involved in making the contamination, but you have to document that you're not involved. So that's the challenge with a phase one, and that's why you would do a phase one potentially on a property that you don't think would be likely to be contaminated. Now, there's also, with a farm, there's the possibility that there were you know, the tractors needed to be fueled, so there is a potential that there would have been some petroleum used on site, and if there's petroleum used on site, there's a potential for a spill. There's a potential that pesticides could have been used, and those are things that, you know, we look for in the historical record when we do a phase one on a piece of agricultural property. So I think, and so Daly International, again, this is a smaller former chemical manufacturer. It was a mixing of janitorial chemicals. They would bring in raw materials and they would mix them into the correct specification, package it, and distribute those. It was later used for storage by the school district, I believe. And this is one where, you know, this is a recently vacated building. It's in great shape. it's in an industrial park or in an industrial area. So hopefully another manufacturer, light manufacturer, will come in and be able to take over this property. One of the things that we did here, and it's a good example kind of a public-private partnership, is we did the phase one with the EPA grant funding. And then we were able to convince a potential manufacturer who was looking at coming in and using the facility to do the phase two. So that was done outside of EPA funding. We did get the results. There wasn't a ton going on in the subsurface, but there were some other issues that caused the project to not end up going forward. But now we have all that stuff documented and it's ready for someone to move forward with it. So we'll go on to the next one, the Fashion Tannery. Now the Fashion Tannery is another site with a long history, and this site is currently vacant. The buildings are on site. You can see from the picture that it's not in the best shape. There were a couple of lagoons in the back that were used for wastewater disposal. And you know, a small DEC investigation was done a dozen or so years ago, and they found that, you know, there's some contamination in the lagoons, but it's not bad enough that it needed to be on their list of sites to clean up. So that doesn't mean that it's clean and ready for development, but there's still challenges here. So we're in the process of doing the phase one at Fashion Tannery. And this was another one that's in a great location for a, you know, commercial or a warehousing or an industrial future use. And we need to basically finish the phase one. This is a site that is already owned by the county, so access is not an issue. We should be able to move on to a phase two and fully understand the contamination. And then we can, you know, put it in a box. We can take away those unknowns that scare off developers and potentially set it up for the county to turn it over through a sale or through some other means to a developer who's going to make productive use of the property again, get it back on the tax rolls, get people working there, and get the site cleaned up. So it's going to be win-win-win for everybody, hopefully. So we're working on the planning process and simultaneous with the environmental assessment. So hopefully we can figure out a good future use and come up with a good cleanup plan and get this site, you know, taken care of and get rid of the blighted property and move it back into productive use. So Cork Chemical Site is a very interesting one because it's kind of a unique site for the Brownfields program, in that this is a site that New York State DEC cleaned up under the Inactive Hazardous Waste program. So that's a program that New York State has where they clean up basically abandoned industrial and waste disposal sites. So what they do is they clean up the site to the kind of current use. And this is another one where it's like the Cork Chemical, in that it's zoned as manufacturing. So they cleaned it up to industrial use standards. Basically what they tend to do in these cleanups is get rid of the soil and the ground. Basically they want to prevent people from coming into contact with contaminated media. So if the city, if it's on municipal water and the contamination is all buried beneath clean soil, which they maybe bring in clean soil to put the contamination under it, then it reaches a level where, you know, it's not clean, but it's not a threat to human health and the environment anymore. And that's where the DEC program kind of stops. So one of the things that you can do with this EPA program is kind of bridge that gap. So we were able to, you know, get EPA permission to do a phase one on the site. We identified that actually it's not that far away from being able to be reused for a different purpose other than manufacturing. The top 5 feet at least, are reported to be clean. The groundwater cleanup has been making great progress in the last several years. So it is really the footprint of the impacted groundwater is greatly reduced from what it was. And we reached out and kind of spoke with DEC about, the potential to change their easements on the site and what it would take to get this site to a non-manufacturing use, which is a lot more likely in the middle of a neighborhood. Because this is a site that is, it's right in downtown Broad Albin. It's in a neighborhood. So something along the lines of a mixed use office building with apartments on the second floor, or townhouses, something along those lines, or a store, that's going to be kind of the appropriate use here. And DEC is very open to the potential that could happen in a fairly painless way. It would be a kind of an administrative hurdle versus an actual additional cleanup, with a couple of additional cleanup things potentially involved there. So the challenge with this site is that it is owned by a non-existent entity, basically. So it's kind of in limbo, where it's not owned by someone that you can get in contact with, basically, and it's off of the county tax rolls also, because it had been vacant for so long. So that's a challenge that needs to be overcome, and there's tools to do that, and we can talk about those in the future. But it's really a great lot and a great location that I think the right developer could really do very well in shepherding it through the BCP program, potentially even too.
So Mark, if a developer came in and purchased it from the current owner, then that new owner could potentially be eligible for brownfield tax credits, correct?
Potentially. That is going to be a sticking point a little bit with DEC, because they theoretically have already cleaned it up under one of their programs.
That's right. They cleaned
so it would be an interesting conversation.
Okay.
The cleanup could certainly be done under the brownfield program, so that you could get that certificate of completion from the New York State DEC. But whether the tax credits would be eligible would be another conversation. And it maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't.
And using the BCP program to get the liability relief, that would be good for going to the financial institution to get a loan. Then that would probably satisfy them then.
Right. That would be a good indication that the property's remediated for the new intended use.
Mark, would it if it were going to a mixed use, would then potentially, because right now they only cleaned it up to manufacturing. So if they did go to a mixed use, then would it be potentially more eligible for brownfield credits?
So
Because it's a different use and they only cleaned it down, DEC only took it down to a certain
right, and
Right.
and that would be the debate, would be whether that would make it become eligible for those credits, because DEC is in a lot of ways protective of the tax credits that come with the BCP program, because it's such a powerful incentive for developers. So it would end up being a administrative discussion that would have to happen with DEC, and it would kind of I don't know is really the answer, and I don't know if anyone knows.
Right. And if I could just
End up
step in,
shaking
I think what you're getting at, Mark, is the DEC would say, we've already spent New York State taxpayer money to clean the site up. We're not going to have someone double dip on this particular site.
Right.
So
Yeah.
let's just back up and take a scenario here where the DEC didn't clean it up. And back to what Mark was saying, that the soil is contaminated. So if we found out the site was contaminated and that the remediation plan would be bringing in a cap of soil on it, in that case, in theory, be eligible. for all the costs associated with that and everything else, in theory.
Right.
But the fact is that DEC spent some money on this, which I forgot.
Yep. So this is, according to DEC, it's cleaned up and into the monitoring program. So that's the challenge there, to do additional cleanup. And EPA has said that they would potentially view this, if it were owned by an eligible entity, they would potentially look at it as a cleanup grant site. So there are potential other funding options out there. But I think the reality is that the remediation that a developer would have to do is not really significant and not much beyond regular construction cost. So what EPA or what DEC is kind of calling for is a subslab depressurization system, basically a radon system, to make sure that soil vapor doesn't infiltrate into the structure that gets built. So that's the additional step that would need to be taken, and it's really not a huge barrier to moving forward if you have a viable project.
And this is a good site to show because it shows a different numbers of opportunities.
Yes.
For brownfield sites. I mean,
Yes.
DEC, brownfield, EPA, it shows the different opportunities that are out there
Right.
besides just what we're working on currently.
Correct, and yeah, I mean,
Goes into what you were saying earlier.
there's a lot of opportunities there, and there's a lot of the tools that get applied to it. What we
Right.
really have to do-
There's no perfect path forward for every site. Every site's going to be different. And there's, I think you had a list of about 5 different cleanup options that are out there, and a different one's going to make sense for a different site. So it's really a getting them on a path and moving forward and keeping options available. Because, the goal, remember, is to get these properties back into productive use, so that the people in the community can benefit from it. So that's kind of the idea. So Skip Service Station is in Northville, and we did a phase 1 on this site with the owner's permission. Basically, it is currently used for storage. There was a gasoline filling and automotive service station that burned down in 2019. And, with the kind of stuff that's going on in Northville and the kind of revitalization that's happening there, a better, more productive use than a parking lot storage facility could be identified for this site. It's in the middle of the LWRP planning area, and it's an area that the town has identified as being available for development, a commercial site. So the next step here would be to complete a phase 2 investigation and see what type of impact to the subsurface historic operations may have had. Now, we don't know that they did have an impact, but when you have a gasoline filling station, there were underground tanks, and the underground tanks sometimes do leak. So there may be some levels of contamination. There may not be. Doing a phase 2 would remove that unknown and make this property more desirable to someone who wanted to do some kind of commercial development on it.
So I assume that this site here is kind of frozen in time because you have an owner of the site who's concerned about the potential contamination. And they probably
Right.
need to go to a bank and get a loan to do a redevelopment on the site. And then they probably can't pass it on. It's unlikely someone will come in and purchase the site. So it's kind of frozen until we can unlock it.
Yep. Until those unknowns turn into knowns, it's kind of, it's up in the air, and it would be viewed as risky by potential lenders or investors in a project.
But I assume also being a gas station, it's fairly well understood.
The good thing about gas stations is there are, and when I say good thing, I mean from a person who does environmental cleanups, there are a lot of them, and the contamination is very similar, and it is easy relatively to clean up. So in my world, a gas station cleanup is somewhat of a known. There are active bacteria and other organisms in the soil and groundwater that break down the gasoline contamination. And they're very widespread. So you usually don't end up with a big issue from a gas station, even if there was a release. And it's very well understood how to fix it. So it's just a matter of figuring out which one of those pathways, the BCP versus the ERP versus the EPA, and whatever other acronyms we can come up with, what pathway the site should fit in to go toward cleanup.
So really, it looks like there's possibly two paths: dealing with the existing site owner and educating them on the potential liability releases they could have. For example, if they were to go to DEC and negotiate a cleanup plan and institute that, they could clean up the site. Would be one way to do it. Another way would be to attract a developer from the outside and sell the site to that person as is, and that new developer would potentially go after the tax credits, correct?
Right. And I think the key is to understand the contamination, and then we can really put a price on what it would cost to clean it up. And then you can go back and compare that to the value of a clean property and see where it makes economic sense.
Because in reality, the site might not even be contaminated.
It might not be.
We don't know that yet.
And I think that, it is, well, I don't want to speculate on the likelihood, but I've seen gas stations that have contamination. I've seen gas stations that are clean, and I've seen everything in between on those.
So that phase two, once it's completed, brings a lot of value to the property in theory.
Yes, because right now it's an unknown. We don't know if it's zero to clean it up. We don't know if it's 100,000 to clean it up. We don't know if it's 20,000. We don't know if it's 1 million. Those are some unlikely numbers out there, but we don't know. It could be anything.
Mark, what's the range of time it takes to clean up a gas station once you identify things? I know it's going to vary depending on contamination, but
it's going to vary depending on the contamination, and it depends on the scheduled use of the site. And in general, the solution is going to be a excavation of the accessible impacted soil. And that goes fairly quickly. So one of the good things about gasoline is it floats. So typically your contamination is in a layer about 4 to 6 feet thick, maybe less than that, right at the top of the water table. So it's only going to be like 5 or 10 feet down. So it's easy to get with an excavator. And then potentially, depending on, flow conditions and what the subsurface is like, you might have to do some additional groundwater monitoring, or maybe put in some additives into the groundwater that boost the production of the biological organisms that break down the contamination. But that's all kind of speculation, but it can go very quickly to remediate a gas station.
So you could go in and dig it up in a few months, couple months, let's say.
Right. And I think
and develop the site with this ongoing remediation.
Right. And you can
site development. So
and you can, depending on what you're going to do with the site, clean means different things. So you don't necessarily have to bring a site to pre-release conditions to make it safe for the site to be used. So as long as you have controls in place that keep the contaminated media, being soil, groundwater, soil vapor, away from people who are going to touch it, breathe it, all of that. And that's something that has to be done very thoughtfully and very thoroughly. You can, use a contaminated site for a productive use. And you'll see that quite a bit in redevelopment. A lot of, gas stations that are open have active remediation going on at them as they're open and as they're still being used. It's a fairly common thing.
Hey, Mark, this might be a good time to pause for a second. I just want everyone to know that's joined us on Zoom that you're welcome to use the chat room if you'd like to ask a question. Is there a hand raising feature, Ken?
Yes.
Or you can raise your hand, we can unmute and you can ask the question you might have. Okay? Thanks.
Yeah, and I think we can move on to the next action slide, and that'll be a good prompt for questions probably too. So what we're doing right now is we're working with the task force to identify these priority sites. The grant that the EPA has given Fulton County Center for Regional Growth, it's not enough to take care of every site. So we got to find the priority sites, and those are going to be the sites that we think have a good chance to be reused and have a ability for us to access them for cleanup and investigation. And then we also want to engage with the public and get their input on this. This is a community assessment grant that Fulton County is implementing. And really, we want, community engagement and public participation so that we can identify the best use for the community of any of these sites where this federal money is going to be spent. And then we can move on to, once we understand what the contamination is, once we understand what the future use should be, then we can create those reuse and cleanup plans, continue the public engagement, and then we can start working to make it into a project and attract a developer who's going to implement the community's vision there with some potentially some new construction or some remodeling or any other way to get this back into productive use. So there's a lot to do there with marketing to developers and hopefully bringing it to the 2023 Mohawk Valley Brownfield Summit. When's that, Tom? That's going to be in April?
April 20.
25th and 26th.
Okay, and that's going to be a showcase for these sites. So hopefully we get some more public input prior to that, so we can bring them forward in a good way for the community.
Mark, is a park or an open space or access to waterfront, is that considered productive use?
Oh, definitely. I think that's a great use of, you need green space. And one of the great things about the Mohawk Valley is there's some great natural resources between some of these trails and the rivers and the fishing and the kayaking and all that stuff. So I think that's a great use.
So even like reuse of a former gas station as a parking lot to access a rail trail would be a good use, I assume.
Yeah, that would be a productive use because it'll increase the recreation. It'll help people engage in some healthy activities, and it probably will be better than, it's certainly better for the community than a dilapidated building that's fallen apart. So really anything you do is going to be an improvement for a vacant and abandoned property.
So really green light thinking, right? Anything's possible.
Yeah. Yep. It's it's up to what you can think up.
So I guess in a lot of ways, the ways for the communities to look at this, they have an opportunity to remove blight and improve general community conditions in parks, jobs, everything like that.
Yep, that's the gist of it, I suppose.
So I guess with that, any questions at all? And you look like you have a question.
No, I don't have a question. What I'd just like to do is, first off, apologize. Our president and CEO had to step away to go to another meeting with one of the municipalities to go ahead and handle some other business. But again, I'm Ken Adamczyk. I'm the economic development specialist here, and I assist with this program. We just want to thank everyone for coming out. If you do have questions, we'll stay on for a moment or two. Mark, I would like you to stay on while once everybody's gone, because I want to I want to go over something with you.
Okay.
But we just want to say thank you for attending, and we hope to hear input. And if you do have input outside, please reach out to us at, our office number 518-725-7700, or email at us at the email on the screen, or at fccrg@fccrg.org.
And you don't have to wait for another one of these meetings. You can contact us anytime with questions, or if you know of a site that might be should be on our list, we can certainly take a look at it.
Absolutely. We're looking for sites.
Yep.
Looking for public input.
So we do have two questions, or one question.
Oh, yep. Let me go get to that.
Well,
They want to know if we can share a listing of potential sites. And I think, is that on the website?
I do not believe so. I believe we can. We'll.
Well, no, because I know there's some concern until we have
I was gonna say. we're gonna-
permission from the owners.
Yeah, we'll run it by Ron.
Yeah, there are legal reasons why you can't just post every site. So we will be posting them as soon as we get to a point where it can be, considerate of everyone involved.
Yeah, there's just legalities because of the ownership of the property. If it was already owned by the municipality, then they could easily say, yes, put it on
Right,
there.
okay.
But if it's a private owner, they may or may not want to.
Correct. Okay.
Just
So we'll-
because of that. But we
So at
can
some
get
point, there
some-
will be a list.
Yes.
And it'll be on the website.
All right, we're working towards that.
We're early days at this point.
Yes.
And thank you, Rosemary. We appreciate that.
And if you do have a potential site, you can reach out to Ron or to any of the members of the task force. And we'll add it to the list.
And I don't know if we touched on this or not, but it's almost like a rotating program. We have the $300,000 grant. And eventually we'll go through that funding, but then we can apply for a second one. And
Correct. So long as we do, we move forward and we do good work, the EPA look kindly upon that. They like to work with winners.
Whenever you're doing good work with grants, they like to do
Yes.
other grants with you, because
Correct.
some people don't.
Right,
And I would look at this initial grant as setting the stage, building momentum, educating people. And as we move forward in this grant process, even within this one, we'll be building momentum, we're having sites. What we really got to find is that one site that people will coalesce around and the buzz will start. And then we'll just build from there. It takes a little while to get going, but we're getting there, one step at a time. And I should say there's grants for planning, there's grants for remediation, there's grants for demoing buildings. You name it, there's a grant out there to get it done. And the question is going to be on a site when we flip it over to tax credits.
So, any other questions? Well, thank you.
Thank you all.
Mark and Darlene, could you two stay on for a moment, please, after everybody else is off? I appreciate it.
thanks for joining.
Thank you. Bye now.